The evolution of the guitar comes from a long history that goes back into the Baroque period in the 1600s, which later goes and changes to fit into the classical period and the Romantic period. After all these years of the legacy of the guitar being passed down for generations to generations is why we can play this magnificent instrument today. It's assumed that more than 50 million people play the guitar worldwide, and yet only a small amount of that people know the history behind the strings that they strum. It's important to know the history of how the guitar has evolved and improved over the centuries because it allows us to appreciate the guitar we have today and make the bond between you and the guitar greater. Since we know why you should learn the history of the guitar, let's get right into this video. Hear that beautiful sound, so subtle yet enriched. What you're listening to is Suite in D minor by Robert Debussy, created around 1650 to 1725. And that is in the Baroque period. Baroque means art and music that was made in the 1600 to 1750. And this music is being played on what you called a Baroque guitar. This was the predecessor to the modern day guitar, although it was more narrower with a subtle waist. And this guitar actually had 9 strings, but we don't actually call it a 9-string guitar. It's important to call this a 5-coarse string guitar, coarse being a pair of strings. So if you were going to play this, you would see that you have 5 strings, but 4 of them are doubled. So all the strings other than the high E are doubled. The high E is known as the chanterelle, which means the singing string in French. The high E was made single so that they could make an easier melody. The tuning for this guitar is really similar to our standard tuning today, but there is no low E, and the double A strings are an octave higher than the low E. And then it's just 2 Ds, 2 Gs, 2 Bs, and 1 high E. The strings were made with animal intestine, called gut strings, usually from sheep. So were the frets too. Unlike the modern day guitar, the frets were tied. This allowed the guitarist to move the frets to get the perfect sound, since they didn't have a truss rod to adjust the neck of the guitar when it bends over time. There were 2 main ways of playing this guitar, which was punteando, which is plucking or what we call fingerstyle, or rasgueado, which is strumming. During this period, the counterpoint was invented and used quite excessively in music. There were 2 ways to create a counterpoint on the Baroque guitar. The first way being the strings would be plucked, but the finger would be held pressed to let the plucked note ring a little bit longer. This overlaps the notes, which creates a counterpoint. The second way is using the fingerstyle method of plucking the low strings with the high E string, which creates 2 similar melodies that support each other. Another thing that was created was tonality, which is the major and minor scales. Before that, music was too complex and difficult to compose as they used modality. Modality was better suited for vocals, but in the Baroque period, the tonality system was used. With tonality, we can make more dense and rich harmonics because we have key signatures to base the whole composition off of. Baroque music will usually only use one emotion or mood throughout the whole song. So if it's a sad mood, then the whole composition will be made sad. Because of tonality, a lot of guitarists added their own improvisations. Another reason for the increased amount of improvisation was since the notes that were written were pretty bare bone. The musicians had to improvise their own dynamics and articulation since the composition was not specific on the dynamics nor articulation. What you're hearing right now is part of Concerto for Guitar in D major by Antonio Vivaldi. In the classical music era, musicians wanted more bass on the Baroque guitars, so around 1750 they added the low E string, and everything else stayed the same. Around 1750 and 1800s, the famous genre of music in the classical period was a symphony. We know that Baroque music was played in a polyphony, where many melodies played together, but classical music is played in a homophony, where only one major melody is being played and supported by the rest of the symphony. Just like the background song you're listening to right now. Classical music was much more simplistic than Baroque, but classical music had more variations unlike Baroque, having one mood. Classical music takes you through a whole emotional journey. In classical music, composers became more specific on how they wanted the piece to play, and they would add things like slurs, staccatos, and be specific on what dynamic they wanted. There was really no room for doing random improvisations with a big group of instruments like a symphony. The beautiful and serene music you're hearing is Capriccio e Rabbe from the famous guitarist in the Romantic period named Francisco Terega. At the beginning of the 1800s, we basically get a new version of the Baroque guitar that we all are familiar with. It was known as the 18th century guitar. It resembles the same body of the modern day guitar, but a bit smaller. It has 6 strings with what we call today as the standard tuning in the guitar. In 1815 was when the Romantic period started. Music composers at the time didn't want to stick to the normal, crisp, polished classical music. They wanted something messier, a little more true to human emotion. So basically there's a huge diversity of sound since there's a huge diversity of emotion. A lot more songs in the classical period used more minor notes, and because of that, it sounded more solemn. Dynamics also started getting a lot more wild, like making triple forte, fortissimo. There were a lot of more drama when making the dynamics, as you can hear in the song in the background. Another concept that came in was called rubato, which means to play it in a flexible tempo. So sometimes it will speed up or slow down. Since the industrial period started, at this time, music for different class levels changed since the rise of middle class appeared, so many concerts would take place at that time, and then suddenly music was for everyone, which is how the guitar has been able to serenade me and you.